Well, welcome everybody to our Tower Center monthly seminar. We have a very special gathering today involving two people that you know fairly well, I'd imagine by now. This is our monthly program where we present scholarship by people who are in the Tower Center or affiliated with it, and sometimes friends of the Tower Center who are not affiliated yet, but they don't know that. Our presenters today, as you know them well, are Jim Hollyfield. He's the director of the Tower Center and professor of political science. Jim has written a tremendous amount on immigration. He's written more than just about anybody on immigration. He's been doing this for a long, long time, as well as directing the center. And he's also written widely on international political economy and other topics. Our other speaker today is Pia Arrhenius, Vice President at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and also a senior fellow here at the Tower Center. She's also served on the Council of Economic Advisors in the Bush administration, advising on labor, health, and immigration issues. And their topic today is their new book, or the third edition of their book, Controlling Immigration, A Global Perspectives. And there are many copies here on the center table if you are interested. With that, I will turn the floor over. Thank you all for coming. Also, thank you, Linda McFarland, one of our board members. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you again.
Glad to be here.
With that, I'll turn it over. I guess we'll speak for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Yep. So, make sure I take the clicker and not the microphone here, which is recording this. But, well, nice turnout, nice group, and it's really good to see so many students here, some of whom I recognize. And I should point out that the book is there for sale. I don't know how much the bookstore is charging for it, but hopefully not too much. I think Stanford had it priced very well. And, as with every book, there is an enormous story behind the book. Pia knows all the ups and downs and ins and outs of this. There were, I think I counted 31 contributors in this book, including all the commentators. It covers 14 countries, including the European Union. And I hope, what I'm going to try to do in my brief remarks is just to give you some teasers about the arguments in this book to get you thinking about immigration and the problems of controlling or managing immigration. And I looked at Pia's PowerPoint presentation, and both of us had like 30 slides. So I don't think we're going to make it through all 30 of them. And I have a whole segment in my presentation just about France and Germany. Those are the two countries that I sort of know best. I could have done, a presentation on the EU as well, but we can come back to those things in the discussion if you would like. What Pia's going to do is build on this and present some things from the book, but also from the work that she's doing for the National Academy of Sciences. Is that it? For the NAS study, they have two new panels. These are things commissioned by the federal government to look at immigration, and Pia is one of the distinguished economists sitting on the immigration panel. I think they also have an integration panel, right, if I remember correctly. So we're back at studying this, trying to understand it, and trying to see how to make policy. So I'm just going to make a few broad points, and then let Pia pick it up from there. The first thing I always like to start with is this little chart here, which shows you world migration trends, and I put a question mark, a crisis. If you look at the total, it's somewhere around 250 million. And if you look at the percent of the world population, it's not maybe a little bit more than 3% of the world's population lives outside of the country in which they were born. So when you hear all the hoopla about immigration crises, and when you're in those cocktail conversations, you can say, but wait a minute, the vast majority of the world's population live and die, if not in the village where they were born, somewhere pretty close to the village where they were born. So we're not seeing a global migration crisis. By most accounts, the 19th century was a much more globalized, a much more open, and much more free century in terms of the movement of people than the 20th or the 21st century. So we're not quite where we were at the turn of the century in terms of the percentage of foreign-born population in the U.S., but I'll let Pia talk about that. This is just, if you sort of look at a breakdown of the size, these are percentages over here of populations that are foreign-born. You can just see how they are arrayed. The U.S. somewhere in the middle here, Australia, Canada, up near the top, Italy, UK, Netherlands, France, and so forth. So, not surprisingly, these big continental empty places like Australia and Canada are attracting lots and lots of immigrants, and they have policies designed precisely to do that. Okay. How do we understand immigration policy? Well, I've already told you a little bit about the trends in international migration. The question that really animates this book is, why do states have difficulty in controlling immigration and in integrating immigrants? And the book builds in part on an argument, or arguments I should say, that I have made many times in earlier books. I think that especially the liberal democracies are confronted with what I call a liberal paradox, and I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And this has led to a big gap between the policies that are on the books, the outputs of policy, and the outcomes. So there's a gap, really, between what the policies are intended to do, the goals of those policies, and the actual outcomes of those policies. One of the results is that in the United States today we have about 12 million people living here who are unauthorized. I don't mind calling them illegal immigrants because they are in the country illegally. They're not authorized to be here. Some call them undocumented. Actually, many of them have documents and papers, so sometimes it's not fair to call them undocumented. And one of the distinctions that I will draw, and I think Pia will build on this, is what I would call the U.S. and Anglo democracies on the one hand, which I will call nations of immigrants, versus other countries out there where immigration is not part of a national tradition, or it's not a founding myth of the nation. So I mentioned the liberal paradox. Here is the way I describe it. If you look at liberal societies over time, the story of immigration in many ways is a story of the working out of the contradictions of liberalism. So economically, I don't know how many Republicans there are in the room here, but Republicans tend to be very strong economic liberals. They want markets to function. They want freedom, for firms and individuals to make decisions. And you can, of course, project this to the national or the international level, which means that countries need to be open economically. If you're going to grow and prosper and be wealthy, you need labor, you need human capital. We know that. So there's a very strong tendency in these societies to push towards openness. But as a political scientist, we know that the political logic of liberalism is different. You have to protect the social contract. You have to know who your people are, who your citizens are. So you need closure, politically and legally. Otherwise, citizenship and nationality don't really... Here, why don't you take this seat?
No.
Otherwise, the state is going to... The sovereignty of the state and the whole concept of citizenship and nationality will be undermined. So this is a paradox. If you think about immigration policy, how can a state be open economically but closed politically and legally? And of course, I'm speaking in relative terms here. This is just a little joke here. Some of you may have seen this joke before. My favorite version of it is, the old chief sitting around with the young braves around the campfire. He's dying, and they say, "Well, what can you tell us about the mistakes that were made in your generation?" And of course, he says to them, "My sons, we had bad immigration policy. We should never have let those Europeans in here." So, we could go on and on about that, but it does point to one thing: the Native Americans didn't have a chance, because the Europeans were so organized. They already had powerful states with powerful armies and navies, and when they arrived, they pretty much rolled over the Native Americans. So if you're going to control immigration, you've got to have a pretty strong and powerful state with the capacity to do that, and the will and the commitment to do it. This is a little more political science or political economy for the students in the room in particular. If you're trying to explain immigration policy, I would say that there are three pretty well-known arguments, and Pia may want to say something about these as well. The first one is just the old logic of push-pull. I mean, people move because they're looking for a better life, a better return on their human capital, or their just to make a better living. So you have demand pull and supply push forces, and these account for a lot of the reasons why people move. But sociologists came along and said, "But now wait a minute. There's much more to the story than simply. It's not just economics. We're not just talking about Homo economicus here, the economic man. People don't move unless they know where they're going. What's going to happen when they get there. So having networks is absolutely critical. If you have family members, or if you have a strong religious institution, to welcome you once you get there. This is social capital, not just human capital, but social capital. That's important. So the sociologists have really helped us to understand migration. And then along come the political economists who would say, well, this is really driven by a sort of factor cost logic. You have very powerful interests at work in every society, business versus labor versus farmers and agriculture. And if you look at immigration, this is the argument advanced by some political economists, it's a bit like trade in the sense that the benefits of immigration tend to be very specific, whereas the costs of immigration tend to be somewhat diffuse. And that's one of the arguments made about why it's difficult to control immigration, because specific interests will capture parts of the state. Just one little anecdote here. In 1996, when we were debating a new immigration law, I guess it was sort of the last big immigration bill that was passed in this country, they were going to cut dramatically H-1Bs. They were going to cut high-skilled immigration. And a guy named Bill Gates and his company descended on Washington with teams of lawyers and lobbyists, and they put a stop to that. Because Gates knew that this would really hurt Microsoft if he was not able to get access to those software engineers. Finally, an argument that is most associated, I think, with my own work, I would say all of these things are the necessary conditions for immigration to occur, but they are not sufficient. The sufficient conditions, I would argue, are more political, legal, and that immigration is really more a function. Since the end of the Second World War, there has been a very big rights dynamic in immigration. So it's not just markets. It's also rights and status for individuals once they get into a society and are able to stay. If you're any immigration lawyers in the room, the thing the government wants to do most of all is prevent those potential immigrants, if you don't want them to come, from putting a toe on American territory. Because once they have magically touched the territory, all of these rights start to kick in. So I don't think we can ignore the rights dynamic. Then there's the question of integration, not just how you control immigrants, but what do you do with them once they get here? And what's the relationship between immigration control and the integration of immigrants? I mentioned the PIAs on the National Academy of Science panel to look at immigration control. Well, the flip side of this is how do you integrate them? And one of the arguments that comes out in this book, an argument that I have made in other books, is that it's easier to assimilate immigrants, and I'm using that term which drives a lot of sociologists crazy because they prefer things like integration and incorporation, and we could argue about what's the right term. But what I have argued in my work is that it's important for a nation to have a strong founding ideal or a founding myth, and that helps you to integrate immigrants once they are there. So we make this distinction in the book, and again, I strongly urge you to have a look at the book and hopefully buy it, of nations versus countries of immigration. We split this book into three parts: nations of immigrants, countries of immigration, and the newcomers. So the nations of immigrants are nations like the United States, Canada, Australia, where immigration is very much part of the founding myth of the nation. I have some great quotes from George Washington saying, "We welcome the stranger into the bosom of American society." So there's a lot of understanding that immigrants are critical in building the nation and building society. Everybody here knows the national motto of the United States, which is "E pluribus unum," from the many one. This has morphed into a sort of multicultural idea about citizenship. I mentioned the work of Will Kymlicka, the Canadian political theorist. France, if we had time, I would talk to you about France. But France has a strong national model. But France is not a nation of immigrants. It's only a country of immigration, because immigrants came much later, after the founding of the French nation. But the French have a very strong national ideal, which is a republican ideal. Which means, once you become French, it's like magic. You are French, you are assimilated, end of story, end of discussion. And, Hervé Chumcam, who just came in, who teaches French here, he knows how the French, think about this republican model and ideal. It's very ideological. We certainly could say it doesn't work that well in practice. You could say the same thing about the American model. But it's important to have these models. If you look at a country like Germany, Germany really struggled for decades because Germany, of course, was destroyed during the Second World War. And along with the destruction of Germany, the national model of Germany was destroyed as well. This Völkisch model of the Volksgemeinschaft, which means a community of the folk, a community of the people. But that is an ethnic idea. And one that has lost a lot of its currency, I would say, in the past decades. This old distinction between the Staatsnation and the Kulturnation, the ethnic versus the civic idea of the nation. France and the U.S. being typical of a civic ideal, Germany being typical of a cultural idea, a notion of citizenship based on blood. So the Germans had to come up with, they had to invent a new idea and a new model. What time is it now? 3:20. Okay. Maybe I'll just hit a few of the highlights, and then I'm going to pass it over to Pia so we have time for discussion. And I'm sorry I'll go through this very fast, but I could spend another hour talking just about the French model, which I would argue is strongly egalitarian, at least in terms of its ideology, very nationalistic. I put down here at the bottom le droit à la différence, this whole debate over the scarves and the headscarves. There you can see a picture of graffiti in Paris showing the French tricolor flag with the girls wearing, the women, I should say, wearing their scarves. That one I like very much too. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. The Maghrébine, the girl from North Africa here wearing her little hat that says, "I'm all for fraternity." So let me wear my scarf or my veil. These are just numbers looking at the French foreign population, the immigrant population. It's about 7, 8, 9% in each case. Immigrants, of course, are the ones who have not yet naturalized. If you look at the foreign population, that would include everybody who was born abroad. These numbers are somewhat lower than what they are in the U.S., but still fairly high by. This is just a picture of migration flows from the 1950s to the present, and you can see that in the 60s and 70s the flows were very high. When the French industry could simply go out and recruit foreign labor, bring them to the country without any papers, and then they would be régularisés, as the French would say. They would be legalized, and adjustment of status, something that we should be familiar with in this country too, where employers have recruited a lot of immigrant labor, but without bringing them through the proper channels, shall we say.
Jim, I have just a question.
Yeah.
On those bar, is it the green represents family members?
You can see how families have taken over the dynamic here, and in some ways, that represents the kind of policies that the French have put in place. But in a way, it's also a natural progression as you have more and more young men coming as workers in this period, and then families following. I'm sure Pia would have something to say about that as well. But family immigration, is something that is, I won't say universally accepted, but in France, in the European and the French Constitution, it's written that families have a right to live together. So, you've got a problem if you try to keep families apart.
That's a distinction between France, and I think if you look at the chapters on Germany and the Netherlands, they're actually moving quite forcefully in recent years to clamp down on family-based migration, whereas I don't think the French have done anything about it.
Well, there was a story here in the 70s where the French government said no more family members, and it caused a constitutional crisis. It went all through the constitutional courts, and the courts said that the government was acting against the Constitution. So it was actually struck down. Just moving along. This just represents the breakdown. It's interesting to see how these populations have evolved over time. The heavy population of Spanish, Italians, Portuguese early on. Later you have the Maghrebans and the Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, and also look at the other African category, how much that has grown from 1975 to 2008. I like this cartoon very much. This came out of Le Monde. Ça doit être dur d'être enfermé. Hein? On finit par s'y faire. Which means, it's tough to be locked up. That's a little French humor there for you. Oh, this guy. He's saying, France for the French. This is Jean-Marie Le Pen. And another one of his favorite expressions is être français, cela se mérite. You have to earn the right to be French. And he, of course, his daughter now is leading this very powerful populist nationalist movement, xenophobic movement against immigration, the French National Front. Germany, I don't have much time here, but Germany gives a great contrast as what I would call, what Phil Martin in the book calls a reluctant land of immigrants, of immigration. Germany, as you know, was a country of outmigration. I mean, half of Texas is populated by Germans who came here and settled in Texas. I mentioned the German national model, which is more of an ethnocultural model going back to the 1913 law, the jus sanguinis, and these different distinctions about nationality, which these German words that are so hard to pronounce, Staatsangehörigkeit, Staatsbürgerschaft. These are different ways the Germans think about issues of citizenship and nationality. And it's a pretty atavistic model, but we should be careful not to get essentialist about this argument. Germany does have a history of immigration. If you ever pick up the Berlin phone book and look at how many names have Polish endings to them. You go back to the early 20th century with the Fremdarbeiter and the exodus of the Aussiedler. These are the ethnic Germans living in Russia and elsewhere who came back after World War II. There were 12 million of these arriving in the Federal Republic in the 1950s alone. And I would argue, this is a critical point about Germany, the model the Germans invented to replace the old Volkisch idea was this model, an economic model. The Wirtschaftswunder refers to the economic miracle, and of course their new social market idea, the Sozialmarktwirtschaft. So post-war Germany, West Germany, was a country, a nation that had an economic idea, an economic model as its national model. Somebody once said the Deutschmark represented the German national flag. Well, you can imagine why the Germans were sick to death of politics. They just were tired of this, and it had led to the destruction of their country. And we know the tragedy of the building of the wall in 1961, which is very important because it cut Germany off, West Germany, which was growing very fast at this point. It cut it off from all of its normal supplies of labor in the East. So they had to look elsewhere for labor. Well, guess where they went? They went initially to Turkey. Then the Greeks complained because the Turks got a deal, and if the Turks are going to get the deal, the Greeks wanted to have a deal. And then even that wasn't enough. They started bringing Yugoslavs and others, and of course Italians and Spaniards This is a picture of when they were recruiting Polish workers back in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is just a picture of the pass that was used for the Fremdarbeiter, the foreign workers during the imperial period. And here you can see the devastation of the First World War. This is the Second World War. This is the Brandenburg Gate. Look at how it's changed there. Oops. Just very stark. That's the Sozialmarktwirtschaft. Here are the Aussiedler. You can see how they spiked coming in right before the fall of the wall. The Aussiedler, all of these refugees and ethnic Germans and others coming in forced the German to change their constitution because they had a blanket right to asylum and they had to get rid of that. The Gastarbeiter model, the guest worker model, again, I'm just going to skip over some of this because I want to go to Pia. I love this picture here. Für 16 Mark eine Italiano. You can buy an Italian for 60 marks. Isn't that great? There's the Turkish guys coming out of the factory. That's a picture of foreign residents and the employed in Germany. You see it's going up to near 8 million, almost 8-9% of the population. Of course, Germany has had a knockdown, drag-out debate about this. My favorite thing is Deutschland ist kein Einwanderungsland, which means Germany can never be an immigration country. It cannot be a nation of immigrants. It has no history of immigration. So it took the Germans a long time to come to terms with the fact that there were millions and millions of settled foreigners in Germany. This again is just more propaganda. This is the neo-Nazi party in Germany with the Ausländer raus, foreigners out. We know about the fall of the wall, which we just celebrated the 25th anniversary of it. You can see the picture there. And the idea is to build a European Germany, not a German Europe. So Germany, I think, has changed. It is no longer the exceptional country that it was. It has come to terms with immigration. It's not, we don't hear the refrain anymore of Deutschland ist kein Einwanderungsland. So the age of Merkel, the rise of a new Germany. So just finally, this is a picture of a book that caused a big furor. Actually, the guy who wrote it was coming from the German Bundesbank, the central bank. And the title is Germany Does Away with Itself Because of Immigration. So the debates have been raging there. I will stop there and turn it over to Pia. Pia.
Thanks, Jim. Just thanks for coming. And I just want to say I should also start by thanking Jim for bringing me into this book project. This was the 3rd edition, and so thank you for, I probably should have thanked you earlier, but it was so much work, I wasn't sure how thankful I was. But no, just kidding. No, it's been very rewarding, and I've learned so much, and I've met Jim's whole network of immigration economists, or immigration experts throughout the world. So it's just been very rewarding for me.
How many of you were at that conference? I think Bob was there, and Ray might have been there. So
yeah.
You remember, it was quite an extravaganza.
Started with a conference at the Federal Reserve Bank, the Owens conference. So it was. It's just been a great, long journey, but really well worth it. And I think the book offers something that's very hard to find elsewhere, which is this comparing immigration policies and immigration histories and experiences across countries. It's very difficult to find work that does this, and it's very ambitious. Of course, the problem with it, as soon as you publish it, it's a little bit outdated. I think that if you use the book or you read it or use it in class, that you should use it, in a constructive way and have students sort of, look at these countries and do and update the analysis to account for changes. Of course, in some countries, the immigration policy doesn't change, like the United States. We continue to have the same problems we've been having since, for the last 30 years. Not much has been done about it. But then in other cases, things have changed a lot, like Canada and Australia, very nimble immigration systems. And so I think if there's something I take away from the book, working through all the papers, the manuscripts, and meeting all the experts and learning about all these countries, every single country has a problem with immigration. That's the gap that that's the theme of the book, is the gap between the policy and the outcome.
Yeah.
The fact that governments cannot control immigration. And so that's what's fascinating. Every country has that problem. But I think what really separates countries is the ability to address the shortcomings of their policies and make changes and move forward and have some sort of objective in mind and reach for that objective. And I think Australia and Canada really stand out, and they've become very aggressive in recent years in terms of changing their policies to address, to make things better. And I just really wish, that's the one big takeaway for me personally, I just really wish we had a more nimble system in the United States where we could do some of the same modifications around the edges. That was one of the points when we developed this paper here for this panel on high-skilled immigration at the National Academies of Sciences, where they're actually very concerned with how we can increase high-skilled immigration to the United States. And so we compared here the U.S. system with the Canadian system just to sort of illustrate a country that's been very, very successful in promoting high-skilled immigration, but still not without its problems. So we can talk about other countries and so forth and get back to that in the discussion. And so I just wanted to give you a few of the highlights of sort of what we presented in the national academies when you compare immigration systems. So the interesting thing with the Canadian immigration system, you probably all know, well, as Jim pointed out, Canada has far higher foreign-born share than the United States. About 21% of the population in Canada is foreign-born. So the population is not nearly that of the United States, clearly, but as a share of the population, there's a lot of immigrants in Canada. There are a lot of problems with those immigrants, though. They're brought in under a point system, which has historically prioritized education levels over employment offers. And so what they've actually ended up with is a lot of high-skilled, highly educated immigrants driving taxis in Toronto. And that was the point we were trying to go through, and that's the point that the Canadians themselves have been trying to address. And so in contrast to Canada, the U.S., of course, our immigrants have a lot. So this is just a picture of the large amount of permanent residence or permanent immigration relative to population. So Canada has had historically much more of that than the United States, as you can see here. But here you can see this point about immigrants are a lot more educated in Canada than they are in the United States. So just look at the bottom of the education distribution. So how many immigrants relative to natives do we have in the United States that haven't completed high school or equivalent? Well, 3 times more immigrants have not done that than natives. Whereas in Canada, actually, immigrants are more educated than natives. So why is that? I mean, a lot of it is also not just the fact that the U.S. has a family-based immigration policy, but also because we've had so much illegal immigration. Mm-hmm. And what the work has showed is that's not so much a failure per se of our immigration policy as being right next to Mexico. That traditionally so much of the illegal immigration has been Mexico. Of course, that's changing now. But anyway, so the Canadians have been really good at bringing in educated immigrants. And here you can see economic immigration under sort of official policies has been much more important in Canada. That's sort of the red piece of the pie compared to the U.S. So you see the U.S. is a very small red piece of the pie. And just to show, we're overwhelmingly a system of family-based immigration. And so in my work with Madeline for this book and elsewhere is that we suggest that this is a system that should change. Because family-based migration is a lot, the immigrants that come in under family provisions are a lot less skilled, less educated than they are if you bring them in under employment-based. And of course, they're not necessarily suited for your sort of employer's needs. Now, that being said, what you find in the U.S. is that despite having a family-based system, because we provide access for immigrants to the labor market, even for immigrants who are not supposed to be working because they're here illegally, they're still kind of allowed to work. And so the interesting thing is with this model of sort of lots of low-skilled immigration and lots of illegal immigration, we've actually had much success in integrating immigrants in the sense that they're working, being productive, they're not on welfare, and so they actually enjoy quite a bit of economic success relative to their education levels in the U.S. And that's sort of been our economic model has been very different from the sort of more deliberate policies of countries like Canada. So this just gives you an idea, obviously, that if you bring in if you have this deliberate economic-based immigration policy, you get a lot more skilled professionals and some more managerial and professional immigrants who take those types of jobs in Canada. The other benefit of the Canadian system is that the immigrants are much more likely to be working age because, again, under their point system, they don't just prioritize education, they also prioritize age, so they actually get points for age, where we don't have a system like that in the U.S. But again, the catch is, well, twofold. I mean, I talked about the fact that historically Canada has just been emphasizing education and not been emphasizing job offers or employment opportunities for these immigrants, and so you've ended up with two problems. One is these immigrants are highly geographically concentrated, mostly Vancouver and Toronto, and then they're not in the employment, the type of occupation that they should be in based on their education background, and then they don't develop the language skills as well either, because if they're having problems integrating into the labor market, that doesn't come very easily. This is just a map to show the levels of concentration, in particular in Canada, but to a certain extent in the U.S. as well. Of those dark red ones are where immigrants are highly concentrated, and so concentration is a little bit more pronounced in Canada than in the U.S. The other problem that you have in Canada is that mobility rates are so much lower than when you compare to the U.S. Again, in the U.S., the fact that we give everyone pretty much access to the labor market really does promote mobility across regions in search of economic opportunity. And of course, it also, I guess, helps that we don't, we really don't have much of a social safety net in relative terms, so that also promotes, people's mobility. They sort of have to seek out economic opportunity.
And a lot of those people have been coming to Texas, right?
Yeah, a lot of them come to Texas, and Lord knows we don't have much of a safety net here. So let's see. But two interesting things. I wanted to make this point, like a place like Canada, which is following really the lead of Australia in this sense in the more recent years, is that so they had this mismatch problem. We're bringing in a lot of highly educated immigrants, but they're not really coming into proper employment, and they're not integrating well into the labor force. And so they did, plus at the same time, in recent years, Canada's been going through the type of oil boom we've been having in Texas, and oil sands, of course, in Alberta. And so they started this new system of visas, or new category of visas called provincial nominee visas, or provincial nomination programs, where they're actually allowing provinces to some control over immigration policy into the provinces. And so provinces that need workers can nominate their own immigrants and bring those in. And so that's a new idea. Now, that existed before for Quebec, because Quebec always had a special arrangement in Canada. But what the other provinces over the last 15 years or so began to clamor for the same rights that Quebec had, and so to also be able to grab their own immigrants. And so that's allowed some distance between education and who gets to come in, because now they really, under this program, they value job offers so much more than just education. So another new type of visa in Canada is the Canadian Experience Class, where they're actually allowing foreign students that come to Canada and others, temporary workers, to adjust to permanent status under the Canadian Experience Class. And so that's another recent innovation they're trying to use to allow more people to stay that have some Canadian experience. And then the most recent thing is the Federal Skilled Trades Program. That's another way they're trying to address the need for more vocational and blue-collar, like skilled blue-collar workers through the Skilled Trades Program, which also gives visas then to people not just with a lot of formal education, but actually with a lot of, with blue-collar technical training. You always hear welders, just like in Texas. There's always a lack of welders for some reason. This just shows how the provincial nominee program in red there is growing over time as Canada has allowed provinces to nominate their own immigrants. And the interesting thing is this debate is taking off in the U.S. Have you heard about it? This idea that regions should be able to have some control over immigration policy. And so the type of regions that have argued for this have been like Detroit, Michigan. They're trying to come back from, they've had a terrible economy for many, many years, terrible administration, lots of outflow of population of the city. And so they really need people to come in, businesses to come in. And so they've been arguing that they should get special Detroit visas, to promote their economy.
I think Baltimore has its own immigration policy. I mean, the city of Baltimore is doing everything they can to get immigrants to come to Baltimore.
Yes, although in the U.S. we still don't allow these places to have, to issue their own visas. But yeah, this is actually part of the discussions now in immigration policy. Here you also see the growth of the Canadian experience class over time. So these new programs are having some impact. Their destinations of new immigrants to Canada are growing more diverse, so not everyone's settling in the same place. Also, Canada is using more and more temporary visa workers. Of course, you don't see any growth in the U.S. in terms of the use of temporary worker visas. We have these fixed quotas on temporary worker visas, and they're not allowed to grow over time. They can't grow with the economy. This is something that Madeline and I are always complaining about, what a poorly designed system that doesn't have quotas that grow with the demand for workers. But so you can just see the responsiveness of Canada. Immigration just think of the oil boom. It takes off in 2010 just with immigration. And so that's what you call a responsive immigration policy. And so in terms of the early indicators for these new programs in Canada, the provincial nominee program, they are able to retain until now, as far as we can tell. The problem is if you have a regional immigration program, are those immigrants going to stay in those regions? They don't have to, obviously, but so far it seems to be working for them. And these particular immigrants seem to have high initial earnings and employment rates. And so the Canadian experience class also looks like it's been pretty successful. But I'll end on this point here. This is just a slide to show you everything that's changed in Canada's immigration system in the last 3 years and everything that's changed in the U.S. So basically they've had a host of important changes, increased the point system's emphasis on age, language ability, and job offers, and reduced the emphasis on education. That's been a major reform for Canada. The shift in admissions from the point system to the provincial nominee program, creating the Canadian experience class, creating the federal skilled trades program, overhauling the temporary foreign worker programs, getting rid of their immigrant investor and entrepreneur programs. They've already seen the problems with these, and they've gotten rid of them, and we're talking about expanding ours, despite all the problems that these particular programs have had in Canada and Australia. So that's another, just a sign of how behind the times we are with our immigration policy and even our discussions. And at the same time, Canada made all these structural reforms. What have we done? We relaxed the work rules for spouses of H-1B visa holders if there's a green card application in process. Great. That applies to how many people? Maybe 30,000, 40,000? And we created this deferred action for childhood arrivals programs, which is kind of a mini DREAM Act, which has been important. And it probably has resulted in temporary protective status for about 550,000 young people. So that's an important change, but that's about it. And what we've done has been done by executive order, of course. There's been no congressional action, no changing of actual laws, just regulations governing immigration. And I think I'll just leave it at there, and we can just sort of have a discussion. Yeah.
Josh.
Great, thank you very much. We'll open it up the floor. I'll keep the cue, so please, sir, please.
I have a question for Jim on your sort of scene set at the beginning. Because unless I nodded off during it, there was no mention of calamities as a stimulant to immigration. War, natural disasters, Haitian earthquake, whatever. Are they just because they're actually small in the total?
Well, I think in the study of migration, we tend to draw a sharp line between refugee migration, asylum seeking, and migration for work, labor, family. And for much of in the early part of my career, I used to think this is crazy, because how can you tell whether somebody is migrating necessarily for political reasons as opposed to economic reasons? And there's still a big debate about this. But as I've gotten older and wiser, there is a reason we do that. And it's because after World War II, I think everybody in the room would agree that was a calamity. There were tens of millions of people displaced. And we created the United Nations, and we had the Refugee Convention, and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And this is all established in international law. Countries have ratified that convention. And for my students always go crazy, I don't know if there's some French speakers in the room, but the principle, it's only understandable in French, it's the principle of non-refoulement, which means you cannot turn somebody back if they show up and say, my life is in danger. So the answer to your question is, of course, there are calamities. I mean, if I could go back to my slides, I would show you that big spike of ethnic Germans. Because remember, one of the consequences of the Second World War is that Germans who were scattered all over Central and Eastern Europe. Remember the Volga Germans? There were several million in Russia. Stalin sent them all to Siberia during the war. The German government said, you have a right to return home. These were the Aussiedler. And millions of them did return. In the late 80s, as the things were loosening up, they flooded into Germany. And of course, many of them didn't speak any German at all. They were Russian speakers by and large. And of course, in this country, we had our little mini crisis, as I call it, with the Central American kids. I don't want to make light of this. I mean, it's a terrible thing, a terribly important thing for these children, by and large. And we could get into a big discussion about what happened there and why they came. There are lots of arguments about that. I would say it's a mini crisis because can we absorb a few 100,000 Central American kids in this country? I mean, I don't even know if we would have a hiccup, really. I mean, it's going to be tough, getting them settled and everything. But in terms of the size of this economy and our markets, sure, we can. But that was viewed at the time like a calamity. I mean, that was a massive problem, but it's sort of died away now. So, yes, the answer is these two things are very important and linked.
My question is related to that. On one of your early slides, Pia, where you compared the family-based and the economic-based, your pie chart showed that the humanitarian, which I assume is refugee-based policy, was about roughly the same percentage for each.
Yeah.
And that suggested to me, as a hypothesis, is that kind of policy relatively uniform across countries, say in terms of the quota that's used by different countries as a percentage of the overall immigrant population? I mean,
it just happens, yeah, it's a good question, Cindy, but it just happens to be the case, yes, and for Canada and the U.S., yes. But if you look at Europe, I mean, historically, it's just been almost all humanitarian migration. And it's a humanitarian because when there's no other way to get in, all of a sudden everyone's humanitarian and seeking asylum for, either real or imagined reasons. And so in Europe, you saw what really was economic immigration, under the guise of humanitarian migration. And that actually is a huge problem because, as a humanitarian immigrant, first of all, there's a very long and costly procedure to determine whether people can can be granted asylum or not. And then, of course, while you wait, you have access, to welfare programs, and you're not allowed to work. Of course, in the U.S., you're invited to work. Yeah, in fact, you have to work. But in other countries, not allowed to work, locked out of the labor market, and this creates all kinds of resentment by natives who really just feel like the humanitarian migrants are freeloaders. So it depends on the comparison. It works just here, but otherwise, compared to Western Europe, it wouldn't work.
Our friend Phil Martin, who's the co-author, co-editor of the book, he always says the worst German nightmare is having refugees coming in and getting a job. Whereas in the U.S., the worst nightmare is that they come here and they don't go to work and get a job. So it shows you the stark contrast about the way we deal with refugees. And of course, go back to Ed's earlier question, there is a calamity going on in Europe right now. We know where it is. It's in Lampedusa. It's in Italy, south of Italy, where you have literally hundreds of thousands of people flooding out of Africa from the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. In the rickety boats, I think there have been 5,000 or 6,000 deaths this year alone. And it's the poor Italian Coast Guard and Navy that's having to deal with the vast majority of this. And the Europeans are supposed to share the burden on these things. So remember, Europe, and the rule in Europe is once you get in, whatever country you enter at, that's where you have to ask for asylum. Well, if everybody's coming across that narrow waterway into Italy, I mean, it's not fair to the Italians that they are the ones who have to deal with all this. Well, anyway.
So I have a sort of broad question from your presentation, Peel. Why is Canada so nimble and we're so not? How has Canada avoided making immigration such a third rail?
Well, I can't really speak to the political side. I mean, they have obviously a different political system that allows a parliamentary system, which allows them to be quite nimble. A lot of the changes they make don't even go up for a vote in Parliament. In fact, they have very high-level rulemaking ability, and so they don't even put these things to vote. But even so, even if they did, it seems like everyone is very supportive. I think the Canadian experiment looks like something that's like we were when we were a frontier economy. We had a huge frontier. We wanted to populate. We had all this extra land. We just needed to subdue the Indians. I mean, so we just everybody come in. Wasn't that the guiding principle? And so that I feel like the Canadians are still trying to populate the frontier.
Well, if you look at public opinion polls, immigration in Canada is popular. It's one of the few countries in the world where everybody seems to like it. Not everybody, but most people seem to like it.
But they're not populating the frontier. You said they're populating Toronto. And
Yes.
Well,
That's why they've made a lot of mistakes along the way. This single-minded focus on education. They ran into huge problems because people were coming in with degrees from made-up universities that either didn't have true programs or offer real degrees, and so now they've adopted all these safeguards to prevent this from happening.
But most of the Canadian population, let's be fair, they all live right along the U.S. border. And nobody lives up in the Yukon, so the immigrants are basically going where everybody else is.
While they're actually more concentrated than natives.
I wanted to ask you about, Professor Holyfield, about your four pillars.
Four explanations about why immigration.
It seems like there's one big one that's missing.
Okay, what's that?
The reproduction rate of the U.S. Last time I checked, is about 1.25.
Yeah.
And it has to be 2.1 just to maintain society. And if you run the numbers out, we will cease to exist at some point as a society without immigration.
Yeah, well, that was covered under the second one rubric, which is, I said, economic and demographic. So don't forget, when you think about push and pull, we're not just talking about what's happening in the macro economies of the sending and receiving society. We're also talking about demographics. So it's not just demand and supply, it's demand pull and supply push. So when you have a society that doesn't have enough people or enough labor, there's an extraordinary pressure to try to resolve that. What I was trying to point out is that, even though you may be in a dramatic situation demographically or economically, it does not guarantee that the state will open up to immigration. The best example in this book is actually Japan, where their population is collapsing, and they will not take immigrants, even though they're surrounded by societies, although China is itself going through a big demographic transition. But there are enough excess surplus labor in Asia that the Japanese could easily have people to take care of a rapidly aging population, but they don't have the national model, the national idea for doing this. And again, we could get deep into a discussion of the Japanese case, which is covered in this book. You should buy it and read it.
Could you explain a little more about how the employment base works? For example, if you have a job and you lose the job, or the company goes under, or if you're dealing with temporary workers, in countries like in the Middle East, they require the employers to provide also health insurance, to provide medical care. Do these countries do that? Like France or Canada? Or
oh yeah,
Germany?
they have public health systems. Yeah, but the U.S. obviously doesn't. I mean, yeah. So our H-1B, our biggest temporary visa program, like the H-1B for the high-skilled workers, those are all professional jobs, and so they would be covered under the employment-based.
But in the U.S.,
healthcare.
we don't, for our temporary workers, require health care
No,
from the employer.
no.
So we throw it on the general public.
Well, I mean, we have an H-1B worker right here with us, and she gets health care through SMU, through her.
It's not a concern for the high-skilled immigrants. It is a concern for the low-skilled
lower
immigrants.
skilled.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of poor people.
Of course, we
in this
don't
country
give
who
our
don't
own
have health
people,
care.
our own people.
Even our own
Yeah. There's lots
Need
of
to
natives
warn
with
them.
that health insurance, especially in Texas.
But this is a big argument in Europe about whether the immigrants are welfare cheats. You know, that's always a big part of the discussion. And hopefully Pia will back me up on this, but most of the evidence we've looked at comparatively doesn't find that this is a huge issue.
Although in there's a chapter on Scandinavian countries, and there it's been immigration is a real problematic because they have such a big, generous welfare state, and they do put immigrants right into it. And so it is a problem and they discuss it at length in the Scandinavian chapter about
That's
how
true.
this tension has arisen as a result.
Yeah, I mean, you can't go to Northern Europe and talk about immigration within 5 minutes the welfare state will come up because they're very concerned. The whole social contract depends on a very tight welfare social safety net, and anything that might undermine that is, they're very worried about it.
Yeah, my question is how much is the United States exceptional in this comparison? Because going back to the first slide of Jim's presentation, he raises the nations, countries that have the highest percentages of immigrants in the country, and then I would say United States, in terms of the population, United States is much larger than any other country. And I think none of the states has a population larger than 100 million.
Yeah.
So, except for the United States. So, my question is that U.S. is particularly difficult to deal with this issue because that is the only country that has a very big population and then tries to handle immigration. And then I think about this issue, factor of population because usually large population countries also have a problem with establishing social welfare policies and especially healthcare policies. And to me, the country that has the largest country in terms of the population that has established the complete national healthcare policy is Japan. So the country whose population is larger than Japan, no country has established a complete national healthcare policy. So, just like we talked about the relationship between immigration policy and social welfare policy. So in that sense, I think the population is a big factor, and it seems to me that U.S. is facing a kind of very unique challenge on this issue.
I think I see what you're saying, and what my interpretation of your question and comment is: if you have large, relatively homogeneous societies, it's easier to build this kind of tight social contract with a strong welfare system and coverage. And there may be something to that. I mean, certainly the Scandinavian societies historically are very homogeneous, and there's a lot of social solidarity. If you compare that with the U.S. historically, I mean, we have always been, a nation of immigrants, and we have people coming from the four corners of the globe at different points in our history, and we are a very diverse society. So, your argument is that it would be very hard to build the kind of solidarity that you would need but I'm not sure I completely agree with you on that or completely follow you on that because, I mean, the American model national model, which of course has evolved tremendously over time. We'd have to go through sort of the different phases in American history. But I'll try to answer this with just one quick anecdote. I was invited to give a presentation at the Bundesamt für Migration und Flüchtlinge, which was the new Federal Institute for Migration and Refugees in Germany, Nuremberg, Germany. And there was a big debate about immigration and about integration, and they got on an intense discussion about integration policy and how you get immigrants assimilated, and they were arguing amongst themselves and talking primarily about the Germans. And the director of this institute, he finally stopped and he turned to me and he said, "Herr Professor Dr. Holyfield, tell us, what is your integration policy in America?" And I said, "Herr Director, we have no integration policy in America." And he looked at me and he said, "You have no policy? How can you integrate immigrants without a policy?" And I said, "Well, that's the point. I mean, it's called a sink or swim policy. I mean, it's a self-help system. The only immigrants, quote unquote, that get official assistance in this country are refugees for resettlement. And that's it. I mean, if you come here, that's why you better have some of this social capital. You better have the networks. You better have a church or a mosque or a temple or something that's going to help you once you get here." I once did some work years ago for something called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, in Washington, D.C. And Jewish immigrants learned early on, you got to have networks and organizations to take care of people when they arrive.
Thanks, John. Can you go back to your, this may be a two-part question, we'll see. Can you go to your final slide that you had, and I may have missed it, when you refer to one of the important changes being the shift in emissions from the point system to the PNP, is that a complete shift now, or is that partial, or what's
it's just a supplementary visa category to the point system where they bring in. So it's separate. Yeah, it's separate. It's separate from the point system.
Well, you may have. So my second question is, you may have addressed this sort of implicitly a moment ago, but I was wondering around the sort of the political and public discourse around the point system in Canada, and what can you say about that? I mean, how is that viewed? How is the point system itself? It's such a stark difference to that of the U.S., and I know nothing about the sort of political language that's used or the public discourse around that in Canada.
I don't know. I'm not an expert on Canadian immigration policy, and so this was,
It's all in the book.
Yeah. But I mean, whereas Madeline and I are sort of on the record criticizing the point-based system because we argue that sort of a U.S. system is preferable because in a point-based system, the government has to choose these points. Yep. How would the government know how many points to give to age, or how many points to give to an employment offer, or how many points to give to whether you're a man, woman, or whether whether you speak French or not, or what country you're from? So our premise is the government doesn't know how to assign points. So let the market assign points. Just let in the people that have employment offers or who are family, like we do in the U.S. You can have a system like that. It works fine. But in Canada, I think what the winning argument is, it's okay to have a point system if you can change the point system when it goes wrong. And that's what they've demonstrated. And so then I think that's the good thing about a point system. In fact, you could adopt a point system that does exactly what we do in the U.S. because it's very flexible. I mean, you could have, 1 point for family or 1 point for a job offer, and then that's it, you're in. So the point system is very flexible. If you can change it, it's not going to stand in the way.
I remember when we did the conference, and Bob and some others may remember this as well, and Pia and her co-author Madeline presented their new book and the audience was full of these European and other experts, and she laid out this idea of auctioning visas, letting the market decide. And I just remember how the Europeans were just absolutely horrified at the idea, that you would auction off visas. Marketizing.
Make money.
Well, I asked my first question about the magnitude of the shift for that very reason. What had given rise to that shift? Whether it was a recognition that the current system wasn't working in some kind of rational sense, or whether there's some political demand.
It was. I think it was the this much faster growth in these provinces that weren't getting immigrants under the point system, and so they were sort of rebelling against the federal government, saying your point system is not working for us. It's not bringing the oil workers to Edmonton or to the Alberta oil sands, and it's not bringing us the welders and the plumbers that we need, and not bringing us the teachers or the college professors. And so, and that was their argument. And because they already had precedent with Quebec, the federal government gave in.
Yeah, I was just in Toronto this weekend, and Jeff Reitz, who wrote the Canada chapter, had lunch with him. And my cab driver were PhDs. I interviewed them going and coming to the airport. Although they have not opened the new train that they're building from Pearson to downtown Toronto, so it's $60-70 Canadian to get a cab each way to and from the airport. So they must be doing okay, these guys. They've got a temporary monopoly on it. If you want to get from the airport downtown, you have to take a cab with a PhD driver. But the fact that Quebec had its own special deal, you can see why the other provinces would say, but no, wait a minute, why just let Quebec do this? We should do it as well. Sorry.
Where are the majority of people immigrating from to Canada? Where is there
let me see if that would be great if that was in here. I can't remember. Is this it?
There you go.
Yeah, so similar, except for we get so many from Mexico, but Philippines, China, India, so a lot from Asia to Canada, and less so from Latin America to Canada compared to us.
The Haitians, there's not that big for Haiti.
Yeah, so similar, broadly similar patterns. Of course, they give points for speaking French, which we don't. But Jim, you'd get a lot of points. Always throwing the French around.
For an old Anglo guy like me, I guess I could probably pass muster. Although the French I speak is very different from the Quebecois. I don't know if Hervé, do you have trouble with understanding the Quebecois? Not really. When you get with a group of Quebecers together talking their patois, I really have trouble understanding what they're saying sometimes.
One thing that Australia did, which Canada hasn't done, which Australia has been really criticized for and was very criticized at our conference and to a certain extent in the book, is what they did with humanitarian migration.
Yeah, right.
When they had so much illegal immigration in the late 80s, early
Asylum
90s,
seekers,
and they just stuck them. Now they just
They
stick
put 'em
these
on
people
islands.
on an island, and they just leave them there to languish. They're not allowed to leave the island, and so they have very small quotas. Very difficult to get off the island. Preferably, they just hope to make you so miserable you just leave. And they just struck a deal with Cambodia?
Indonesia.
No, it wasn't Indonesia. It was they struck a deal to take their asylum seekers to Cambodia, and so now they're shipping these people up the. What's the name of this island? It's probably in the book. But that was a big discussion and argument at the conference. Was unbelievable how the Australians just became very aggressive to combat. They don't want the asylum seekers, and they've been very aggressive in deterring them from coming.
Well, but one thing to keep in mind here, which was I was at a conference in Toronto this weekend, looking at a book called Culling the Masses, written by David Fitzgerald, David Cook Martin, and the sea change that has occurred in the way so many countries deal with immigration. U.S. immigration policy was horribly racist, for decades and decades. And for some reason, we did change it. It took us a long time after the war to get rid of the old national origins quota system, which was designed to only let in white Northwestern Europeans, to cut out people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So one of the big questions that we debated this weekend is how did this change occur? Why did it occur? And when I started my remarks, I pointed out that if you read Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, he has several pages in Mein Kampf where he praises American immigration policy because it is a race-based policy. And eugenics was accepted wisdom in the late 19th and early 20th century. So there has been a really unbelievable change in the post-World War II period in the way in which deal with immigration and manage immigration. Is it perfect? No, it's certainly not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than it might have been if you go back to, say, the 20s or the 30s.
Okay, well, on that note, please join me in thanking Kim and Pia.
Anybody wants to sign books, we will.
Yes, they are.
But you have to buy them.